Hey everyone, Pastor Tommy McMurtry from Liberty Baptist, back with another video on assurance of salvation. And we're going to go to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12 and look at a verse that is often used to just cause people to doubt their salvation, wonder if they are saved. And Philippians 2:12 says, "Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." Now, this verse gets misused by a lot of people, and even people that are right doctrinally often just kind of end up butchering this verse. But I recently heard someone who believes you can lose your salvation use that verse to prove you can lose your salvation, because I mean, you need to work out that salvation with fear and trembling. Obviously, what about our salvation would cause us to fear and tremble? I mean, I thought we had salvation. Well, must imply that you can lose it. Some people use it to teach a full work salvation. There's all kinds of crazy things people do with that verse, because if you isolate it by itself, well, then it could sound like a lot of different things. And you always have to take everything in its context, and people don't do it with that verse. But think about it. Telling somebody who has salvation to look at it, and for anyone who's saved, to have fear and trembling. Now, that doesn't make sense, because salvation is faith in Jesus Christ. Does God want us fearing and trembling about our salvation when it's supposed to be, based on faith in Jesus Christ? God does not want us putting our trust in Him and then biting our nails and being all scared to death. That is not how things work. Whenever you are trusting God, He wants you to be joyful. He wants you to have confidence. He wants you to be victorious. That's what we see throughout the entire Bible. So to apply that verse to soul salvation in any way just completely contradicts everything we read about salvation in the Bible. So what does it mean? Well, simply put, it's not talking about soul salvation. It's talking about physical salvation. That's what it's talking about. Physical salvation from being killed, from persecution. And so let's look at some context to prove this. Now let's go to the previous chapter. In chapter 1, I'm going to show you something. In verse 18, it says, "What then, notwithstanding every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice." Some were preaching the gospel for the wrong reasons. Paul was just glad it was being preached. And the reason Paul was glad Jesus was being preached, even by people who didn't like him, was because, in verse 19, "For I know that this shall turn to my salvation through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ." So was Paul glad Christ was being preached so he could get saved? Was he glad that they were praying so he could get saved? I thought he already was saved and telling other people how to get saved. He's not talking about his soul salvation. He's talking about his physical salvation, because he's in prison. When you're in prison, you need salvation. You need to be saved from jail, but not your soul doesn't need to be saved. Your soul's secure in Jesus Christ. So in verse 20, he says, "According to my earnest expectation, my hope, that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but that with all boldness as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death." Paul was looking at this time at possibly dying. He was fine either way, as long as Christ was magnified. "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." We all know that verse. And he was saying this, not just talking tough. No, this was a situation where he could have died, but he didn't believe he was going to, because he believed he was going to be saved from that death, and he was. "But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor. Yet what I shall choose, I want not." I don't know what I want. He's like, do I want to be physically saved right now, or do I not want to? He's like, I'm not even sure. "For I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better." Now, why was he thinking he's going to be with Christ? Because he thought he might die. "But nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. And having this confidence, I know that I shall abide and continue with you all for your furtherance and joy of faith, that your rejoicing may be more abundant in Jesus Christ for me by my coming to you again." So Paul was confident that he was going to get through this, that what was going on, the preaching of the gospel, their prayers, it was going to save him from death. And it did. And that's a wonderful thing. So to apply that to soul salvation, you say, well, that's a different chapter. Well, the thing is, when we go to chapter 2, we'll see that things haven't really changed as far as context goes. In fact, he starts off the chapter saying, if there be therefore any consolation in Christ, any comfort of love, if any fellowship in the Spirit, any bowels of mercy. If you're going to get consolation, okay, in Christ, he said, fulfill ye my joy, that ye be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves. And then he talks about how, we know this verse, how Jesus, he humbled himself. He took on the form of a servant. He became obedient to death, even the death of the cross. And so after he says this, he talks about how even Jesus humbled himself and died. If Jesus humbled himself and died, we should be willing to do that too, because we don't have that far to step down. Jesus did. So if we've got to go to prison, if we've got to suffer for his sake, we should be okay with that. We should be able to handle that. And so he says, wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Do all things without murmurings and disputings. So he's telling these people to work out their salvation with fear and trembling. It's okay for you, if your life is being threatened, to try to figure out how to save yourself. That's okay to do that. It's okay if you're in a dangerous situation to work out your salvation with fear and trembling and running and hiding, whatever you need to do in order to save yourself. It's okay for you to do that, but don't get out of the will of God. Don't stop the work of the Lord. Let the Lord do his pleasure. Stay in his will, and even if that means your death, we should be okay with that. But, and so that's why he said, and then he goes on to say, do all things without murmurings and disputings. Now, we bring that up when people in our churches are complaining about the color of the carpet, the temperature in the building, whatever it is, some discomfort in the church. Paul was talking about that to a people who serving the Lord might cost them their lives. That's who he was talking to when he said that. But it was a reality back then that being a Christian might mean you're going to suffer. It might mean you're going to die. And so for them to work out their own salvation with fear and trembling, there was nothing wrong with that. But so then, now understanding all that, to use that verse to make someone think they can lose their salvation, to cause someone to wonder if they're saved, is ridiculous. A saved person should never fear and tremble when it comes to their salvation. We should rejoice in our salvation. We should rest in our salvation. We should have that eternal security and joy of knowing that no matter what happens, we are going to go to heaven. And no matter how bad somebody butchers that verse, if you have been saved, you will be saved forever. Nothing can change that. I hope this was a help and a blessing. God bless you. We'll see y'all next time.